I think what we can do now is discuss, but in the plenary. We had prepared a format of workshop again for the afternoon, but perhaps we can do that all together and try something different. The questions that we had prepared for the team work were two, actually, and I think one is very important. What can museums learn from NGOs' work, practices, and what NGOs can learn from museums? And how can bring these two universes together and really find a way not only to do joint projects, but to work as an NGOs and the museums work as the NGOs and the NGOs like the museums and learn from each other. This was one question. The other question was how can museums take an active role in the dialogue between societies and migrants? Which is a very broad, of course, question and needs a lot of thinking and discussion, and we have already done a lot during the day, and perhaps this is not for the right moment to pursue. But for me, having planned this meeting today with the objective to bring these two universes together, it's very important to understand how this can work. And how it's working already. Because I think what Melissa is doing is exactly the mixture of what an art, cultural center can do, a museum with collections, and with the mind and the mechanisms of an NGO. So let's think.
Refugee is a juridical status, isn't it? So NGOs that deals with refugees, they're not necessarily dealing with migrants, because it's like the United Nations elect some countries to say that they're in a real crisis, and so the other countries should receive them as refugees. And how is the impact in Greece of this difference? Because I don't know, in Brazil we receive a lot of migrants from Africa, and they are not necessarily refugees, they don't have this status. And so the policies are different from migrants and refugees. So are they allowed to, so they can receive the same benefits, a lot of commas, benefits of refugee children when we're talking about school, or they can live in refugee camps if they don't have the status of refugees. So if you can, I don't know, South Sudan, usually now they're beginning to receive this refugee status, but not necessarily in own countries. It looks like a formal question, but there's an impact of how can you deal and how can you engage or develop projects depending on the policies. Mm-hmm. Because if you had like a refugee, ACNUR or United Nations, and the ONGs could receive money and museums can think about partnerships with some kind of audiences, and migrants not necessarily, depending on the way. So it's just the basic question if in this, all the policies here in Greece for refugees, they also include migrants, or that's not a big issue if you compare numerically. I don't know how to explain better. It's just an open question.
I think it's a very important question, although I'm not at all the specialist to answer, and I will not do that. What makes me think is that definitions are very important, and also in order to go beyond the stereotypes, because we are using a lot of them in the museums as well. But on the other hand, we may have specific funds from the States or from Europe or from UN that are for this or the other or the third category, and that makes it like the logistics of it. So perhaps Lenny might be the person to answer.
I can
and maybe Smaros as well.
And Maro, yes, of course.
First, at least for MSF or Médecins Sans Frontières, we don't have money from governments or organizations or anything. They're all donations from private people. So already it's a different situation for us. We're not dealing with trying to see
Policies.
Yes, no, it's management that MSF decides how to use it and how to help. It may be a silly answer, but in my work, we are not talking about working with refugees or migrants.
You're not categorizing.
No, we're talking about our beneficiaries. Who benefits from this service? Where is the need? In Elliniko, is young people from Afghanistan. They're obviously most of them seeking for refugee asylum, so they may be accepted or not, but granted this status or not, but this is not how we call them. We call them beneficiaries. At the same way, in the city center of Athens, with the daycare center, which is open to all, Greeks, non-Greeks, migrants or refugees, we are not going, in a city as Athens, the problem is never isolated, because you have a migrant who's been here for the five years or 2 months, who has drug problems or not, who has a communicable disease or not, so you have so many, who is pregnant or not pregnant, who needs medical care, so you have so many categories. One person is not just one thing. So for us, a way to deal with that, I think in my everyday work, is we are offering our services to beneficiaries who benefit from this service because they are in need. We're not going to examine, how long have you been here, or are you fleeing war or not war? How much war do you have in your country or not? How much drug addiction, are you too much or not? No. They're there. It's not an easy thing to come and ask for help. So they're in need. Okay, so this may answer.
For the UN, things are a bit more rigid. So there is a specific legal definition of what is a refugee. So it is a person who is fleeing persecution from his own country and cannot go back. And persecution is a rather large, has a large definition. It could be religious, political persecution, etc. UNHCR has a specific mandate for refugees. That's why sometimes we think, well, it's a bit strange. It's a very bureaucratic institution. Why do we insist so much on definitions? Because only asylum seekers can benefit from packages or assistance from UNHCR. And don't forget that there are so many UN organizations, and they're very sensitive about mandates. So you cannot overstep another organization's mandate. For instance, UNICEF is with children, etc. Sometimes in emergency situations, the lines are blurred. For instance, I know in certain contexts, UNHCR, although they have a mandate for refugees, they could close their eyes and also assist internally displaced persons, for instance, or migrants as well. But it depends on a case-by-case context. And I think in Greece, the situation is quite blurred because the initial, distinction was not made. So you group everybody together. You have UN organizations saying, but we are only mandated to help asylum seekers. The processing, the initial steps have not been done, and so you enter a state of paralysis where nobody wants to come in and do very much. So this is the situation here at the moment.
Can I make an observation? Since our objective is to see what we can learn from each other, what museums can learn from the organizations, from NGOs, and vice versa. It seems to me, because we've discussed this a little bit within our group about definition, and we know we need to work on this for the project, for the migration project, and we need to be specific, and we know we must be able to unpack all denominations. But at the end of the day, if museums have some kind of independence, then we want to cater for people's needs more in line with what Eleni was saying. So if we need to learn, I think as museums, something from this conversation is that we need to understand the definitions because it's important for our work, but we need to know that we have to be flexible in terms of who we include in the programs, because the
classical, there are refugees, obviously, the war. There are people that go to, that are work migrants, and that they migrate to work in other places, not because they want, but because they have to. So it's, they're not refugees, but they suffered similar traumas. They're separated from their families, they leave everything behind. It's not very different, the needs are shared. And we as museum professionals need to have the sensitivity to look at the individuals, and then that's what we were saying, we need to, it's important to group, but it's important to look at people as individuals and understand that they have needs that we can understand how cater for and mediate conversations.
It's very important that you brought up the problem of definition, because Europe is on the way, or in the process of being thrown apart, being breaking down, because there is no compromise, or there is no exact answer right now. So I think that we all here in the room, we have a political role to work with the people coming to our countries and cities and belonging to our city societies. As long as they are there, and we don't care why they are there and when do they leave, they are there. And we have to make European people understand that it's necessary to be with people coming to our countries, to be a real arrival city. Because these answers we will not find right now. We have Brexit, we will have Frexit, we will have maybe no German exit, but a lot of other exits. Yeah, I mean, we are on the way. So we really have this political role.
I think that it's interesting. I've been last week with Diana, that she's the main director of Ellis Island, and we were at Sorbonne to talk about immigration museum in France. And we were sharing the space with the curator of contemporary art, and they were dealing, and I think I'm talking about like a Latin American perspective, so Gege and I were like the Latin American, South American. Yes. And of course it's different from being European, but we can see as a new country, a lot of commas, because Brazil is not that young. But I think that the main thing that I'm observing as an observer, remember the teacher talking about observers talking to observers, that the main discussion, and I think that it's this being provoking by Trump and the conservative raising, it's how these differences are going to influence in national identity. And then, so I think we begin talking about national identities. So when we're talking about cities and immigration museums and city museums, every time we're talking about layers. But when we're talking about national identity, you have to put everything together and to mix everything and make like strong enough not to see the parts of national identity. So national museums, or museums that are dealing with the French identity, with the German identity, sometimes have a more challenging issue dealing with contemporary migration. So all the German discussion about what are going to be in 20 years the German identity when we are receiving these different people. And so I think that discuss future is discuss this flexible identity, this fluidity and Bauman thinking. And I think this could be a core discussion also, like a conceptual thing to think about. So we're all migrants in a way. All the cities were arriving cities, passing cities in a way, because we have layers. So, and then I think that we have this aim to, it's like this political road to commit ourselves to talk. It's always been here, like it was different, another context, but these issues, they were here. So we invented a lot of things to unite, but now we have to tell about the parts that make this union. So I think it's...
I think that's a wonderful point, and as someone who's spent a long time working in a national museum, I would just encourage city museums to take the flexibility that they have in not being burdened with having to speak to that national identity, to do the opposite, to kind of use the flexibility around crafting the narrative of their city to be more inclusive and to really drive home this point about everyone being migrants. I think it's a really unique opportunity, and I think there's actually underutilized possibility in that construction to bring more and more people into that large umbrella of migration, because it can be such a flexible term, and it can be something that so many people can be included under if we shape the narratives in an inclusive way.
I love the idea, Nicole, every time. She's really inspiring about hyperdiversity, and the Rotterdam Museum is always an inspiring model. How can you do this in a contemporary perspective and shape these things? I think that the proper word is to shape these narratives. I loved it, the idea.
Just a reflection, of course, I think that the idea of showing that we are all a mosaic, the first idea. How important in politics, in international politics, the museum are. We can see, for example, in Syria, that ISIS destroy museum and archaeological site is not because they are foolish, but because Palmyra was a city 2,000 years ago where different culture meet, and they could live together and be rich and again rich. In the future, no school will go to visit Palmyra. Nobody will have that idea that it was possible, and if it was possible, it can be possible in the future. So they have a precise idea in destroying the memory of the collaboration between culture. So we have a really political strength. We are really important in remembering that it's possible a society where person collect trying to live together and became rich in it, and that we have an alphabet, that if we have number, if we have bread and wine, it's because people made each other. So I think that our museum have to give this, to return this memory of a past of successful unity to those who don't want to see it. So I want to build a confine because I feel safe if I close myself, but if you close you will not have wine and beer and bread. And we have to explain it to the people who don't remember that they are migrants, they are a mosaic. Yes. And we have to invite in museum person from other country for showing that they are part of us already now. Our history was made with them, with their alphabet, with their numbers, with their art. And we are a mixture with what they did during a long, long history. The future is not today. The future is thousands of years.
Not completely true.
No. Okay.
Because, may I?
Yes, of course.
Because we have the museum of the last century, of the 19th century, in Europe, have been built as a national museum to support the national identity. Yes. We have the German museum, we have the French museum, and everyone has a message of domination.
Yeah.
When you get to the old German museum, they spoke not about the Europe, they spoke about the Roman invasion.
Yeah.
And it was, when you go to, even to the Greek museum, you speak about the barbarians and the supremacy of the Greek mind, the democracy and so on. When you go to the National Museum of Rome, you speak about the fascism. We have state museum, national museum, city museum, which are still the museum of Barbarossa, the museum of the legal law, and we are in a moment in which we need to pass from the national identity
Yeah.
to the transnational identity,
Yeah,
which is the
right.
only one that can accept the mixing, the mestizo culture. But we have been educated in a national culture.
Yeah.
Some of us are making the transition, but the most of the people that will vote in the next election have been educated in the old culture of the 19th century. And the parties are still fishing in these ideologies. So our problem is
Who spoke about speak to the opposite side. That's why we need to find a way for speaking to the opposite side, to persons who are educated in a nationalist idea, a nation idea. Because I think if we are here, that we think that we are.
But you see, you are people from the City Museum. The City Museum are the nearest to the reality, because the cities is where the things are happening. But if you were the people of the general econ, so the people of the national museums, you were thinking very differently, because let's see.
But also, it's okay to be transnational at a city level. It's a positive thing.
Yes, of course.
It's part of the soft power of
Absolutely,
cities.
yes.
It's seen as a positive thing.
Yes.
But as
As a quality.
yeah, and but it's not every country that has a very nationalistic view on their identity, but right now seems to be growing around the world, the nationalist vision of identity at a national level. So I agree with Masun that, you know, cities have this opportunity, the soft power of cities that's been discussed.
And it's not something new. We know that city museums for a long time are developing exhibitions about how it is to be a person from Copenhagen, from Rotterdam, from Lisbon, from Frankfurt. We know that some cities like New York have their own identity. So it's different to be an American citizen and different to be a New Yorker, which is amazing to think that you can get your ID because you are part of the city, not part of the nation.
Yeah, and this New Yorker is much more transnational than the American.
Exactly.
The best spot.
I'm afraid I would continue the same discussion about what you've asked, and I believe it's a very important issue, as much as I'm very thankful for what you said. We saw in the earlier the museum in Frankfurt collecting the memory of the immigration and of refugees. And I can perfectly know as a Greek that the Greek people, they came as Gastarbeiter in Germany. They needed to have so many certifications that they were nationalist, okay, etc. And not only, but the priest and the school teacher who was sent by the ministry, they were really working for the police department and giving report. One of my cousins who happened to be consul in a city like that, he was going to see during the dictatorship, for instance, all the worst thing for his taste. He would rather prefer to go to the opera, but he had to go to hear all the resistant groups, etc., just in order to be able, as the consul, to contradict the report of the school teacher who would have said that you have been there and then your family would have paid. That is one thing, is to know that what we call community is not necessarily a very happy thing. It includes a lot of contradictions, and it includes a lot of resistances to the transnational, you say, and to the mosaic. On the other side, I'm terribly convinced myself that Europe is perhaps one of the very last places where we can work on it. But on the other side, you are right also to say you have prostitution, you have things like that. I mean, you say you have people, they benefit something. Okay, I come to you and I am, let's say, drug addict. And you can help me. You don't know I prostitute myself in order to be able to pay my drugs. And usually the whole circuit of prostitution, drugs, immigration, illegal immigration, etc., is the same circuit. And for that, you have beneficiaries on one level, but there is no way to have, until now at least, I haven't seen any proposal, not among us, but among the institutions, the follow-up, that a person who is treated as a prostitute can also be followed up in order to be emancipated and to escape from the drug dealing and from even customs like polygamy we have in France, Arabic families, they still have uses like polygamy, and they are perfectly allowed because you cannot enter the community. And then this is something I believe it should be, in a way, the future of our museums, to work as networking. It's a pity Mr. Polychronis is not here because he really spoke about that. Instead of talking about transnationalism, which is like talking like transvestites or something like that, which is a kind of very problematic issue, I would say if we network ourselves and we manage to have the one helping the other to emancipate people, this is a very 19th century idea. I'm terribly sorry. I have nothing against the 19th century. You had people like Victor Hugo who really fighted for things like that. So I am here because of this poor child who stole the bread, and the policeman had to follow him all his life, and that was a 19th century novel. I don't know many institutions today, they can't do the work somebody like Victor Hugo did. And we are somehow obliged, in order to work like transnationalist or networking, to include history. Not to say that is obsolete or that is 19th century. You have to include the fact that at a certain point, identities can change, that we have hundreds of identities, not one. Sorry, that was all.
He mentioned the museum in Frankfurt, and I think you have right. And I think that's our mission as a museum through projects like that you show in Frankfurt, to make clear that what you mean as community in sometimes or all the time is a construction. In the communities, you have many differences. You have political differences. You mentioned that. You have ethnical differences. You have, because we worked also with the Turkish community. And then, of course, you have to question yourself, what is the Turkish community? Actually, the Turkish community in Frankfurt does not exist. You have so different facets of the communities. You have the Kurds, you have the Alevites, you have the communists, and although for many people in Frankfurt, the Turkish is the Turkish community and they have a certain image in their mind. So I believe projects like that make for us possible to show what exactly you said. And that's why projects like that are very important. Also to research the migration history of cities. Because many things, people think things about things, and it's only images. It's not the historical truth. And you have that with every community, not only with the Greeks. You have that with the Italian. You have that with the Spanish community, because we research different communities. And so I don't see a problem. I see a very big chance to yes. It's a very yes.
If I can just add one thing. During the dictatorship in Greece, I was studying abroad, and I could have taken the status of refugee because I was forbidden to come back to Greece. I refused because I considered that as a Greek citizen I was doing my duty and I was not a refugee. I was resisting a dictatorship, and we were in Europe, so I don't need a medal or any recognition for being a citizen of my country. After the end of the dictatorship, I refused to do my military service because there was no enough clarification about all the fascist militaries, and I wanted to be conscientious objector. And the status of conscientious objector was not recognized in Greece, so I should go for 4 years military prison, so I've become an illegal refugee because no European country would recognize that Greece was not not part of the European community, and of course, nobody would care. So I had to go from one country to the other, to go to the United States, to marry, etc., until at the end I had to make my military service against my own conscience. So I believe also what you said, what is a refugee? When do we understand ourselves as a refugee? Who is deciding who is a refugee and who isn't? It is a matter of a lot of layers we have to redefine on many possible levels and not just on one level. It's not a matter of identity. It's a matter of practical issues.
Just a quick word, because you mentioned the networking, and I totally agree with you. I think that it's part of your perception as well, because otherwise you wouldn't be, you wouldn't have here Melissa, the Ministry of Education, or Médecins Sans Frontières, and I'm really grateful for that. And I just want to say, and I'm sure it's the same thing for Melissa, when people come to us and they come to the mobile clinic of the psychologist in Elliniko and they say, I have a toothache. Okay, they don't have a mental health issue, but they have a need. It's not what we do, but this doesn't stop there. What we're trying to do is link this person to a service that can help this person. And this is part of the networking. This is in Elliniko. There are 5, 8, I don't remember how many NGOs working. UNHCR is there, the government's there, MSF is there, Save the Children was there. And we are trying to see how to work together. So networking for us is very, very important. And a proof of that, and I'm sure you have similar issues with your own, the people who come to you, because a person never has one isolated problem anyway. And the proof of that is also the fact that you have invited us here. And for me, what I take home with me today is the opening to this kind of events and workshops, because it's not only about medical services, it's more than that. People have more needs than that. Okay.
But also the museums can maybe support, if we're talking networking, museums are incredible spaces, they have some resource, they have professionals, and they can support other initiatives, and I think that's why Marlon wanted to invite
and
everybody.
the contact zones, as Susanna said, and it's a known term for a long time, but how we practice it, there are many different ways to do that. And Nicole wanted to say something.
Yeah, something was said about the truth, and lots of communities were mentioned. And also the question, is it a refugee or a migrant? For our museum, or how we work with it, that doesn't really matter, because we are really focusing on how we live together in the city and what themes are important for people living in Rotterdam. So it's more about, for all people in the city, sustainability is important, or innovation is important, etc., etc. So we're trying to focus on these themes and trying to look for people who are really engaged with it. And then about the truth or the image we have about communities or groups, I believe museums can play a very important role in it. And as you may remember, I showed you the Chinese Pinda salesman this morning. The Chinese migrants were seen in the last century when they just came as the most filthy people around. So no one wanted to engage with them. And now they are seen as a very successful group of people. So it's just, it can change, and museums can help very much in that image we have of other peoples, I believe.
Museums can do a lot of things. Perhaps they cannot offer the practical help that sometimes people need on the spot, or they can do that as well, because Yannis showed us in the morning in Thras the humanitarian project and then the empowerment project. But I think we also need to remember that it's not only that part of their life that they live in the museum. They have another part of life that is full of practical problems. And we're not going to solve them ourselves, but we need to remember that there are these problems and find perhaps the solutions and networks.
I'm coming from a practical country. Oh yes, Germany did not invent pragmatism, but we are very practical people, as you know. I think, Marlene, museums can be practical in terms of working with refugees. Like we in the City Museum of Düsseldorf, I told the Syrians, if you are hungry and thirsty, you can come to the City Museum. I give you to eat and to drink. And that's important. It starts there. I just wanted to say, because I have the microphone not working, but you can hear my voice anyway without the microphone, the arrival city in city sociology means, and that's very important to remind us, to leave the communities their identity. Because it means that they come to the city and that they live together among themselves in their own community. That means the arrival city being theoretically and practically exhibited last year in the German Pavilion at the Architectural Biennale from the German Architectural Museum in Frankfurt. And that's very important, to leave their own identity. So that means also that museums, like we in Düsseldorf, for example, have colleagues who do speak 5 Arabian languages, because the refugees, migrants, people, they speak their own language in the City Museum. That's also important and practical.
Just a couple of points. I think museums have a tremendous outreach opportunity to collaborate with NGOs, with a variety of stakeholders. And I think museums have to come to an agreement about what are the messages that they want to send. How a common stumbling block in many of the presentations was the fear and the resistance. How can museums change perceptions of how migrants and refugees are welcomed? Or so, in this context, I mean, the changing the narrative of how a cultural history is presented in a certain country is obviously extremely important. But I also think that we have to, we as museums, have to be very sensitive, sensitive to the use of language. Because we use, when we were talking in our group about the stereotypical image that comes to mind when we talk about migrants or refugees. The same thing about talking about beneficiaries, for instance. I'm allergic to this word because it gives the impression of somebody who is pathetic, who is a receiver, but not a productive member of society. So I think we have to change the use of language when we change the use of the narrative as well. And I think Eleni also mentioned the word integration. So there are a lot of heavy terminology that we need to change. And the other thing is that we have to be a bit more look more outwards to the various stakeholders. One thing I would like to see is how do museums engage with the media, for instance? In the issue of migration, it's a very important stakeholder that has immediate visibility that can provide good information or misinformation. And the last point is the government, which is a very important linkage. You know, I think museums have a critical role to play in creating linkages, but also with the government. I think the NGOs are doing an excellent job, a very courageous job, but where is the government in all this? I'm not talking only about Greece, but I'm trying to make, you know, general points. It's particularly pertinent in Greece, yes. But how do museums engage local and national authorities? Because if you don't create these vertical linkages, you will be isolated, you know, you may undertake isolated actions, but you will not have the desired impact always on a much larger scale.
You were saying that although museums could not address specific needs or practical needs of migrants and refugees, but I think museum would have a very crucial role in terms of influencing the local governments to be able to respond to the needs and aspirations of migrant communities. And also it's, I think, important for museum to really take stock of all the rich experiences of migrants and use this as an advocacy for, you know, as a conduit for migrants to be able to reach to the, you know, local governments and to the national governments. Yeah.
I would like to just remind you that all these refugee and migrant flows are changing constantly. I'm not going to speak as IOM, I'm going to speak as Open School that I've been volunteering for 12 years. We had a lot of Pakistani and Bangladeshi people back in 2005 when we started, but it changes all the time. In 2005, the Greek society was clueless of what is going to happen. And then you see that migration and refugee flows, it's a river. So no matter how many walls you're going to build and how many archipelago in Aegean, you're going to have, the people are going to cross the street and they're going to remove any obstacle. They are not going, nothing is going to stop them. But at the same time, we have to remember that, like, I am a museum person, but I'm not a museum person because I love to go to museums. I don't know how they work, and I know it's very complex. And I think museums should overcome this complexity and come again back to the society and have quicker reflexes. Because a lot of people still consider museums as keepers or guardians of memories, while they should start to create more memories to people. And what we see is a moving target. Your target is moving and is changing in shape, in size, in quality. We had immigrants, now we have refugees, now we have economic immigrants. So I love what is happening here, but I also think that you have to act a little bit faster, because even as Mrs. Kotsoni said, it's a lot of people, most of the people consider Greece as a transit place. So even this transit place is an exceptional case of people that they can develop and they can learn things and they can discover themselves through the history of other people. That's it.
I think other people spoke about this, before today, about talking to the other side, and you're saying we need to go beyond, we need to, the flow of migrants is always moving, but the problems and the challenges are in common. And then for us to bridge this with society, and that society to act faster, the way that we can reach people that we're saying we need to talk to those who don't agree with us necessarily, stop praying to the converted. We need to basically do more what we call audience research. We need to understand the non-visitor of museums if we want museums to be relevant, because actually 95% of people are non-visitors, and they are the people we want to talk to, and this is something we do very little. And we need to engage with migrants and help them also understand their perspectives by asking what they want, what they need, how do we attend to their needs, and the non-visitors. Suzanne, Anna, your experience mirrors something that I've just been through in Brazil with the museum I'm working with. We knew that there was a certain group of youth that we really wanted to come to the museum that were non-visitors at all. They wouldn't engage. We ran focus groups and we asked, what will make you come? And they said, internet and food. There you go. So we have internet and food, and they will come now. They'll come to do homework in the lobby of the museum. So then we start talking to them and we start having conversations. So it's, remember, audience research and the non-visitor.
And common sense as well.
Yeah.
I think we're a little bit in a very uncomfortable situation in museums right now, because we're in the middle of a paradox. On one side, we try to get migrants, migrant descendants, refugees, which are all very different groups and very diverse inside, to get to the museum and convince them it's a safe space. We had the word safe space. And at the same time, we're trying to deal with people who are not convinced that migrants are good. So we cannot be a safe space and at the same time deal with people who are actually against immigration. This is difficult to define the museum as a safe space if we have those two clashing things next to each other. But museums have both roles. That's one thing that is very difficult and that we need to think of. Can we consider ourselves a safe space? Can we offer a safe space? Can we make that promise if we actually dealing with groups that really do not get along? We have to deal with those groups who do not get along, but we cannot offer what is called a safe space per se. I'm not sure that we can promise migrants you'll be safe here. Safe space in that definition, or the people of color safe space. Like a place where I can come with security and talk. It's very difficult. It's at the same time, we kind of forget a little bit the question of funding. I'm very sorry to be the super pessimistic voice right now, but city museums depend on city funding. And if you are lucky, you are in a hyper-diverse city, which is completely aware of its diversity and wants to do something with it. If you're really unlucky, you're in Dresden. Or you're in other places where a lot of population is not going to agree when the mayor is going to give I don't know how many million euros to make such projects. I had a colleague who told me, actually, we had to cancel a series of things because they were told the city is not ready. So how do you deal with funding questions? Populations that don't want the same thing. Traditional visitors of museums who don't want to hear about migrants. Migrants who don't feel home. It's a very difficult situation. Plus, we've got another point. It never ends. European funding, for instance, or German national funding, whatever. They use that vocabulary. Integration. They finance projects that are meant to integrate. I dislike that word very much, just as you do. It's this dissimulated forced assimilation thing is very dangerous. But museums have to keep producing programs using those words because that's how you get the funding. So it's very difficult. It's a constant resistance. It's not producing new things and being engaging and being happy. It's a struggle, I think. And I think museums, city museums, national museums have to be ready to get in a constant struggle with several parts. I think the difficulty of city museums nowadays is to be unable to satisfy everyone. And it's going to happen. And including ourselves. We have to make massive compromise using words that we would never use, and we have to. We have to cope with people we would never talk to in a daily life. We have to. We have to do. That's reality. I'm talking about Pegida people. It's very hard, but we have to name it. And it's going to be hard to be everything at the same time. That's just what I'm saying. So the problem is it's a very urgent moment right now. We are in a very moving situation where everything goes fast, and we need to build sustainable structures too at the same time. And we have to be careful that we do not distract those. Sustainability, word of the century. But that's very difficult because we're providing emergency structures, and in Germany it's quite typical too for social services. As long as the crisis is gone, we dismantle structures. In 10 years, we'll have to do all over again. So we have to think about it too. There's so many points that we need to take care of at the same time that it's difficult not to get discouraged. I work for a charity dealing with migration history, so I'm absolutely all up for it and collecting and doing stuff. But this is the realities we're dealing with, and these are not going to go. Unfortunately.
Sandra, thank you so much for this word of reality.
Of sadness.
I would not like to go on, but it's a reality.
Yeah.
It's not pessimism. It's you.
Glad to hear you see this as reality.
It's a reality. But we have to face it in order to find a sustainable solution.
Regarding the sustainability, I have just a comment because our project is focusing on the arrival city. So our perspective is arrival city perspective, not the departure city perspective. But there is another side. There is a reason. Susanna, for example, she said that we are not looking why they are coming to our city because it doesn't change anything for what we have to do. We are not looking when they are going to leave, okay, because it doesn't change anything. We have to do something, but the reason that they are leaving their home country is important, not only for us, for them as well. For example, the population exchange between Bulgaria and Turkey and Greece and Turkey is not only people who moved, they are being affected, but also we are being affected. It's also a problem in Turkey. There's a reason people are leaving their countries, and for museums, there's a need that they focus on contested histories for that. So how we will deal with those contested histories that they never happen again in the future. It's very important because otherwise it will continue in a way.
I will grab what you said, the contested histories, and remind everyone that we have this year's theme in ICOM is contested histories and the unspoken histories and how we deal with them in the museums. So we will be discussing a lot about that throughout 2017, not because it's the theme of the year, but because it's very important to discuss that. And I thank everyone for this wonderful, really mind-opening and insightful discussion we had today in so many different ways. I know that you are exhausted and very hot, but it was worth it, I think. And we will share everything very soon because we film, we record, we make notes, and we will share everything with you and the progress of our project.